I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Wednesday, hump day, we talk about business and wealth creation typically on Wednesdays, and today will be no exception. We're pleased to have today Danielle Duncan, who is with Twin Cities Habitat, a great organization. We're going to find out about what they do, what their priorities are, how she got to the organization, what her mission is as a public servant, and more. Before I begin, I want to thank our sponsor for the program, and that is 9,000 Equities, Build Wealth Minnesota, helping 9,000 Black families become home owners. Thank them for their support. They might jump in on the program today. If we do, great. Also, we'd love to have you be involved in the program wherever you are. If you're listening on any of the social media platforms and want to connect, leave a note in the comment section. Let somebody know that you're watching the show. Let us know where you're watching from. We want that engagement with you, and we appreciate you supporting the show. How do you support us? Become a subscriber. Go to the YouTube channel, Insight News MN, and become a subscriber and like and share. And we've crossed our 1,000 subscriber mark. We're looking to get to 2,000, and that only happens when you take the initiative to go and subscribe, no cost. But in fact, Cooper is my producer. We talked about this. We want to offer incentives, and I'll do this over the course of the program. If you're interested and have a comment about today's conversation, if you leave a comment in the comment section, but before your comment, use the word baseball, we're going to provide you a chance to win a pair of tickets to a Minnesota Twins baseball game in August. We've got several sets. We'd like to give them out to people that want to do baseball and who love this program. What you got to do is be a subscriber, and you got to make a comment, and your comment has to start with word baseball and say, I like this, I didn't like it, here's what I think. It can be anything you want to say, but let us know you're interested in being a potential winner of a pair of great seats at a Minnesota Twins baseball game in August. Well, with that, let me bring Danielle Duncan in. Danielle, so good to see you. Thank you for being here. Appreciate you and your work. My notes say that you spent over 20 years as a public servant. The mission has always been to ensure that at-risk individuals and families and communities get equitable access to a whole variety of opportunities. You, at the Habitat, you oversee the development and implementation of their diversity, equity, and inclusion specific initiatives designed to foster an inclusive environment for everyone. In terms of your academic background, you got a Bachelor's of Science degree with cum laude honors in psychology from Augsburg University, and you have a Master's of Business Administration from the Carlson School of Management. You are an accredited facilitator and qualified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventories called IDI. Well, let's go to Habitat 101. Let's have you introduce the organization's mission, the vision, and then we'll talk about your role there. Good afternoon. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. I've been with Twin Cities Habitat for about a year and a half, year and 7 months. And when I saw this job opening, so it's an organization that is dedicated to affordable housing, but also what is baked in is that advancing racial equity in housing. And I was attracted to the organization because any organization, they talk about DEI, they talk about diversifying. But what I noticed with Habitat is actually walking the walk. And so it's just not, DEI for DEI's sake, but it is actually changing programs, changing lives in order to make sure that we look at that home ownership gap, that we're closing that, and we're actively doing it, not just for talk, but for the impact that we want to have in community.
And so how do you do that? How does Habitat, what's the field, the play, the playbook for Habitat and its clients?
Well, the playbook is about centering our clients. When you look at Habitat, not only international, but even at the local affiliate, we've been around for a long time. And so what we do recognize is that when we look at the home ownership gap in Minnesota, it is significant. It's one of the highest in the country. And so that means that we have to show up and we have to do things differently. And the way to do that is put our homeowners, our home buyers center, and then being able to build from there. We have a few initiatives, especially our Advancing Black Home Ownership program, which is just fantastic, in which, again, we're listening to what community has said are some of those barriers and develop some programs in response to that. And so with our Advancing Black Home Ownership program, there is additional financial assistance and cohort support that is culturally specific, because we do have to bring that cultural humility for all of our interactions, especially if we're going to engage and work and partner with those homeowners and home buyers in a way that is actually going to have an impact on home ownership outcomes.
And so for the consumer, for the resident, the potential homeowner, how do you show up in their life? How do you help them move from being a renter to a homeowner? What's the process?
And I'm glad you said that, because I think when you're looking at even the rental market right now, it's pretty high stakes, meaning you have to spend a lot of money. But what we are is an alternative to that. And so you're actually building equity and not just kind of building equity for your landlord. And so it is just figuring out who we are. I think there is kind of a lot of misconceptions about who Habitat serves. And so we are for everyone. And so I would even say a lot of people, even nowadays, qualify for our program. And that ranges between, at the bottom, at the minimum, is $50,000 per household. And so with that, you get access to, if you're a part of our Advanced Black Home Ownership program, access to some special education that it is, again, cultural specific, that is in a cohort model. You receive some additional support when we're looking at kind of down payment assistance and things like that. And I think also when you're looking at who we are as an organization, we're a home builder, we're a home developer, we have the Restore, of course, but we have our programs and services team, which is, again, when we talk about being representative of the community, that's definitely where you see that representation, because you want to be able to relate and create programs that are going to be responsive. But we're also a lending organization too. And so when you come to Habitat, you're getting everything.
Well, let's break all that down. We've got time, and just take your time and go through all of the programs that you have, so that at the end of this conversation, people feel they've been given really complete, thorough introduction. And my goal is that somebody listening today decides she or he can be a homeowner, or that they know someone, and this conversation is going to move them in that direction. So let's talk with the idea that somebody's going to be able to take the information we give today and move and improve their situation. So walk through your programs.
So when you look at, again, someone who has a need, someone who's renting, who is paying an astronomical amount for rent, I think there's also, when you're looking at the demographics we serve, one of the things that, again, attracted me to Habitat is that when we disaggregated our data, here's an organization that looked further into the data and figured out who we are serving and who we are not serving. And by that, we were able to kind of really pinpoint where some of our trouble areas were. And because through that, and we've had a partnership with Research in Action and Dr. Brittany Lewis, who helped us understand through focus groups, through surveys with our homeowners, our home buyers, and even some other constituents, to say, all right, how do we create a program that is going to be responsive to the needs in community? Through that, we were able to create our Advancing Black Home Ownership program. We also got some additional information on, let's look at representation to make sure that we are representative of the communities we serve. I think there's also the element of racial equity, of course, because when we're looking at the home ownership gap, we have to look at racial equity, and we have to be an organization that just doesn't care about racial equity. We have to be that organization. So again, making sure that we're representative of the community. We're also bringing those programs and services that are going to meet those needs. And I'll also kind of take us back a little bit to even my story. And so I grew up, I would say, not necessarily unhoused, but pretty unstable housing. I
Mhm.
remember coming home from school several times and seeing my clothes that are set out because we got evicted. And
Mhm.
so when we look at stability, that is absolutely one of the things that's most important, especially for children, because that sticks with you. It really sticks with you. And once I got of age, and I had my first son when I was 18 years old.
Mhm.
And so again, still, a little wet behind the ears, but here I am in charge of another human being. And the reason I was able to go back to school, the reason I was able to actually still have a job is because we had someone in the family who owned property in Chicago. I'm born and
Mhm.
raised in Chicago.
Mhm.
And with that, I was able to get a couple roommates and paid little rent. Almost, I think what I remember is $300 a month for rent, which is
Mhm.
completely unheard of right
Sure,
now.
sure, sure.
And when we moved to Minnesota quite a few years ago, that's what I wanted to provide for my family. And so we were able to kind of, again, very lucky being in the right spot, right at the right time, we're able to purchase our home next door. And that is what that is designed to do, to give my family and our children a stable environment so that they didn't have to worry about am I going to get set out? Why are my clothes out on the street or anything like that? And so again, it's for me, it's that wealth generation, it's that wealth stability that we need to make sure that we're doing not only for ourselves, but the generations behind us. And so I was able to kind of utilize the gifts that were from my elders and be able to pass that on to my children as well. And so with Habitat, that's in a kind of feels like that as well. And so kind of understanding what those barriers are, listening and being able to create a pathway for home ownership is something that we are committed to doing and something that is within our programs. It's built in. And so someone who is interested in Habitat home ownership, first get to know us, go on our website and understand all of our different programs. But there are opportunities not only to purchase homes that are Habitat built, purchase homes that are rehab habitat homes, but also the opportunity to purchase on the open market. And one of the fantastic things that I find about Habitat, there's choice. And so again, when we come back to the question of racial equity and making sure that we have home ownership paths, it's ensuring that people have choice and not just kind of saying, this is the shoe you need to fit, wear it, whether or not it fits or not.
You mentioned your website. I'm on your webpage now, and I looked to the section that's called Advancing Black Home Ownership. Let me just read some of it. It's pretty impressive information. It says that Habitat for Humanity's vision is a world where everyone has a decent place to live, but a structure of intentional and systemic racial discrimination in the U.S. has created barriers to home ownership for many Black families. It says that systemic discrimination has persisted into present policy, from redlining and to inequitable access to mortgage credit. Taken together, these practices are barriers to saving for a down payment, for getting a loan and affording a home, and they threaten the vitality and prosperity of every community. Across the U.S., your website says Black families are less likely to own their own homes than white families. And during Habitat's 45-year history, the work has helped close that home ownership gap. For example, in the fiscal year 2021, Black homeowners made up 43% of families who partnered with them to build with them. But they said they can do more. Habitat is an established affordable housing leader, both as a developer and mortgage provider in the U.S. That statement from Takia Jordan, who's Habitat for Humanity International's Vice President of Housing and Community Strategy. Awesome information. And I'm glad that you all have a strong presence here. How large is your organization? How many people are you able to serve in Minnesota? What are the numbers for your impact locally?
For locally, I don't have those numbers right now, but what I would say, and the statement you read is from international. So we're part of a global affiliate network, and we represent the 7-county metro area. But when you talk about our Advancing Black Homeownership program, that is one of the things we're most proud of. And so it's one of those things where we not necessarily, we turned everything upside down because we were in response to what community needs. And so when we talk about even the special purpose credit program, that is additional funding and additional cohort support, that is definitely a part of that. What I would say also for the special purpose credit program, we have our next graduation, I think August 17th. So this is a cohort of individuals who are foundational Black Americans, meaning US born, and can trace their ancestry back to enslaved Africans. And so what it is a program where members who have those that are eligible sit in a cohort. They get financial coaching that is culturally relevant. They're in a room with others who look like them, who have similar life experiences, and coached by people who look like them, who have similar life experiences. And so what I've noticed, or the number that comes to mind, is when we look at where we started prior to this program and where we are now, we have seen significant gains in the graduation of individuals who have gone through the coaching and who are mortgage ready and able to purchase a home.
Let me invite my colleague and friend, Jonathan Palmer. I call Jonathan one of my companions. He's a person who is traveling along with me and many of us on what we call the road to liberation. Yes. And freedom for our people, and in the belief that the freedom we seek is a freedom that recognizes the sacredness of all human life. Yeah. And so it's not exclusionary freedom. It's not my freedom and your lack of freedom. It's my freedom is your freedom, and your freedom is mine. Jonathan, brother, good to see you. How you doing? It's been a minute, but glad to see you again.
Great to see you again, Al, and great to see you, Danielle.
Nice to meet you, Jonathan.
I am just, Habitat is such a great organization, and this kind of effort is so essential. You can look at the fact that the home ownership gap between Black and white homeowners is higher than it was during segregation at this point, and down 2.2%, I think, since 2000. I mean, it is. Home ownership is so essential to actually helping to build wealth and helping people to climb out of poverty. And efforts like these are what make a huge difference. So I'm really glad to hear about this effort. I'll be sharing this out through my network so that people can get connected into it.
Thank you, John. And one point you made, Al, is that it's not exclusionary. And so how we look at that internally at Habitat is we lead with dignity, meaning that we're all connected. And so more rights and more liberation for you does not mean that there's less for me. Right. We're all connected. We're all of value, and we all deserve the transformational power of home ownership. Because as you said, it is one of the building blocks for wealth generation. It's one of the building blocks for being able to pass that wealth on to future generations. And so we have been excluded from any kind of semblance of being able to build that wealth. And so what we want to make sure that we're doing is bringing our programs and services and what we offer to community that's responsive to what the community needs, but also working in partnerships, because when we look at the home ownership gap, that did not come yesterday. This has been around for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to take us some time and some intentionality to start unwinding that. But we cannot do this alone. We have to look at those different intersections so that we can continue building the coalition so we can actually bring liberation and home ownership to more people.
You mentioned working with Research in Action, I believe. What kind of data drives the mission of the organization?
For Research in Action?
Yes.
So Research in Action, they look at a lot of data points. I think what we were able to do with them is disaggregate our own data and really take a look at who we were serving and who we weren't serving. Mm-hmm. If you look at the top line data, I think it was approximately 83% BIPOC families or households that we served. And so we could have just gone with that and say, look, we serve 83+% BIPOC families and just moved on. But what we needed to do is actually take a look under the hood and understand who we were really serving. And where I kind of liken it to is that when you look at, again, that huge home ownership disparities between people of color, foundational Black Americans and whites, it's like, all right, what can we do here? And so by being able to kind of look at our own data and figure out, all right, we are leaving some people behind, is how we can respond.
And so when you disaggregate, what things do you discover?
What we discovered is our foundational Black American households who were applied for our program, they were among the highest demographic group, but were among the least likely to graduate. And so that's warning what's going on here.
Yeah, let's sit with that. What does that mean? And what was the intention and the discovery, and the data revealed what?
The intent was to find out who we were serving and who we weren't. And also what we kind of discovered, again, when we look at that 11% or whatever difference it was between succeeding in that program and not succeeding, that was a wake-up call that says, all right, we're doing something wrong, that we have to kind of look at our own behaviors. We have to look at our own policies and see where we might be the problem. I see that as an equity lens. So who is benefiting from our programs and who is burdened by it? And what we found is that we overall served our immigrant population pretty well, which is great. But when we look at our foundational Black American population and that applicant pool, it's like, all right, they're not succeeding at the way we would want them to. And so what can we do for how we show up, how we support our homeowners and home buyers to ensure that we're in partnership with them? And so we want to serve and be in partnership with our clients and our homeowners and home buyers. And so what we were able to do, again, with that feedback that Research in Action helped us collect, is make sure that we're bringing in representation into the organization, some people with those lived experiences, provide some additional cohort support. So again, people who look like them and who are able to kind of relate to those life experiences, but also that additional financial support when we're looking at down payment assistance.
Back at your website again, and I'm looking at the notes on the racial home ownership gap. Two bullet points here. One is the home ownership rates for Black and Hispanic Latinx households continue to trail that of white households, Jonathan, as you just mentioned. And as of the first quarter of 2020, this is a little bit dated, the home ownership rate of white households exceeded that of Black and Hispanic Latinx households by 25 to 30 percentage points. It also said, second bullet point, between 76 and 2016, despite national passage of laws aimed at reducing discrimination in private lending, racial gaps in loan denial remained persistent, meaning Black and Hispanic Latinx borrowers had a higher probability of being denied a loan and of receiving a high-cost mortgage as compared to their white counterparts. So your program, aided, armed by data, by research, set out to make a difference. And you are making a difference. Talk about that, if you would.
No, absolutely. And that's what we want to make sure we're doing. It's data informed. And so when you look at the cold, hard facts, you can actually see where we are, where we can improve. And so when you look at it locally, I think with overall, like 42% of households of color own their home. But when this is kind of statewide, but if we look at even our gap for the state, it's 35%. So it's much wider. So nationally, it's home ownership gap is 25%. So the state in Minnesota, it's 35%. And so when we look through kind of being data informed, we want to make sure that we have those points that we can kind of pull back, because it's not something that we're making in a silo, that this is what we want to do. We're looking at history. We're looking at our data to try to figure out, how do we improve? How do we show up and support community in a way that they want? Not necessarily what we want, but what they want and what they need in order to improve and go along their home ownership journey.
Jonathan, feel free to jump right in. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of times it's not really understood where this comes from and the roots that this has in systemic racism. I mean, you can go back to the start of redlining in the 30s and the beginning of the FHA loans, taking people back to a time when it used to be that you put down half for your house and then you paid the rest off over 5 years. Well, that wasn't sustainable. So when the FHA loan started, you had, that's when you get that 10% mortgage down in the 30-year mortgages. And then they created those maps in the cities across the US that rated what the return on investment would be in a community, and going ahead and pinpointing the ones that would have Black and brown people versus that were white communities. And many people don't realize that single point is largely what started this trend of this gap of home ownership, because in the communities that had just one Black or brown family in a neighborhood would rank it low so that it was marked in red, and that's where the term redlining comes from. White communities got the green mark, which meant people would loan more in those communities. When they started doing the FHA loans and the home financing, out of that, I think it was a total like $12 billion went into that, and less than 2% of that went to Black and brown communities. So you get this gap that starts there and grows over time. And as segregation is there, people aren't allowed to live in certain communities. In Minnesota, we still have covenants on homes that say that Black and brown people can't buy those homes. So there's a lot of systemic pieces, I think, that people don't realize. And it sounds like Habitat's effort is one of those looking to address that and fix the systemic problem, which will help increase home ownership and build wealth within our communities.
And I think I'm glad you brought up racial covenants, because that is, you go to your deed. I had to go to my deed. I lived in South Minneapolis. Like, am I supposed to be here? And so when you talk about the systems, it's individual, but it's all of the institutions that have been set up a certain way, and they're working as designed. And so you go back to even the racial covenants, again, looking at my deed, am I supposed to be in South Minneapolis? And so on my house, I could not find one, but if you go 2 blocks in any direction, racial covenants everywhere. And so when we talk about bringing that awareness, bringing that history, a lot of people don't understand that. It's like, no, this was a thing. And then again, as you said, fast forward to redlining, where you have people or places that were valued based on the perception of people. And so again, when we look at kind of the work that we want to do, it's one, uncovering it, like acknowledging our racist history, because it's there, it's still living. And if we're looking at kind of uncovering and pushing us forward, we have to look at what's happening in the past in order to actually make that change we want to see in the future.
And one of the things that we have to note is the need to do healing and unlearning, the impact, the consequence of the trauma of racism, that which is, obvious, aggressive, but that which is less obvious, institutional, structural. What do you mean? So just as you were speaking, Jonathan and Danielle, I just have to picture the memory. Danielle, you said you have to check the records to see if you belonged in the neighborhood. And so what does that mean for a grown person to walk through a community and have to have that internal dialogue? Should I be here? I'm an American, I'm a Minnesotan, but
I pay my taxes.
Space in my mind and spirit that makes me doubt my value as a human being and second guess. And why I'm saying this is real and real simple is that I flashed back, Danielle, to when I first got to Twin Cities here. My brother had met somebody and they lived, we thought, on Washburn Avenue in North Minneapolis. At that time we lived in, I'm not sure, South or St. Paul. But I was driving him down Plymouth Avenue one afternoon trying to find his friend's place. And I hadn't really known the north side, driving west on Plymouth and drive past Penn Avenue and alphabetically, Queen, Russell, Sheridan, all the streets. And I got to where the street curves. I don't know if you know North Minneapolis, but there's a little curve on Plymouth Avenue around to what arises is the golf course and the chalet. And so imagine me, I may be 22, 23 years old, new to Minnesota, drive around the corner. I know North Minneapolis generally is considered a Black community. But the further west you go, the bigger and the nicer the houses get. And all of a sudden you drive around this corner and you see this big castle on a hill, which is the chalet. Well, I don't know what's a chalet. Looks like a place where white folks are, right? And so my first internal panic button went off. Uh-oh, am I in the wrong neighborhood? Am I supposed to be here? And is there danger ahead? Because my growing up in Kansas City, to know and to be in a neighborhood like that structure represented meant that if you didn't work there, you wasn't supposed to be there and you were in danger. And even if you worked there, you couldn't be there after dark, sundown, right? So the point I'm making is this question of the impact of institutional racism, internalized racism is real. And unless we have these conversations and examine how this trauma has been transmitted to us from our own and from generational experiences, we continue to not embrace and enjoy the potential and the things we deserve. That's what I think. Does that make sense to you, Danielle?
No, that makes sense. So I've been in my home for over 20 years. So the neighborhood has gotten a little bit more diverse, but I was the only person of color in a 2-block radius. Why did that happen? Without understanding the history, how we've been kind of pushed away, it just, maybe the problem is me. I'm in the wrong neighborhood, but this was designed intentionally. It was designed to get the most out of the land and push those who we as a society have deemed as unvalued or whatever, when we talk about even the redlining pieces. And so we have to understand that history, because only through understanding that history do we kind of start to deal with kind of the trauma. Even if we weren't personally kind of involved in it, we have to understand why we have these pockets of poverty, why we're getting denied for loans faster or quicker, why we aren't successful in certain programs, because they weren't designed with us in mind.
And one of the things people don't really realize is, as you said, this history isn't just the pieces on loans and things like that. There's a section in South Minneapolis, down around 46th and Columbus. And in 1927, residents down there formed the Eugene Field Neighborhood Association, and 100 of them signed a gentleman's agreement that barred them from selling or renting the property to anyone not white. And there's actually a little monument down there that you can go and see. It's for the Arthur and Edith Lee House. Down there, members of the group started buying up African-American homes in hopes of making the area all white and restricted. But Arthur and Edith Lee purchased this house. And it's an interesting thing that two neighbors had this disagreement. And so it got so bad that the one that was moving out sold it intentionally to a Black family to get back at the other. But people came out, crowds formed down there around the house. The neighborhood organization tried to buy it back from them, tried to get them to move. They had 4,000 people out in the streets, okay? And they brought vendors came by, they were selling ice cream, and this was all to protest.
It was like a lynching, lynching.
Yes. Yeah. and you had to get, NAACP came in, led by Lena Olive Smith, and they were able to have police and eventually get things settled down. But that's the kind of stuff we live with. That's just a community. That isn't the March on Washington. That isn't the Montgomery bus boycott. That is living in a neighborhood in America. And so when you talk about that piece, are we supposed to be here? There are so many signs that people are not cognizant of when you move into communities and it's an all-white community. That didn't happen by accident. And Danielle, I think you pointed that out earlier, is that these things were designed, and people don't understand that fully when you talk about where the history, because people think about 2000. They don't think past the pandemic or past the 90s. There's a lot of pieces that have been put in place that have structured racism within our communities. And it's hard trying to find a place to live and having to be confronted with that.
Well, we can even go back to the Constitution.
Mm.
Yes.
It's designed, it's working as designed. And so I think Foundational Black Americans, when we look at BIPOC communities, we're always on the outside. And so we have to convince society of what our value is, convince to society that we are equal, that we are connected, we are of value. And so the only way to do that is we have to understand the history, because again, it's not something that, we want to create this in a silo. It's like, no, we're not creating this in a silo. We're looking at the history. We're understanding that history. We're living with it too. And so only through that are we able to make the changes, but we have to understand what has happened and what has led us here. Otherwise, we're just throwing things against the wall. It's like, all right, let's kind of understand the value, how we've been valued from the very beginning, in order to have a realization of kind of the things that we need to do. And I think you're so right that trauma, and even for me, I guess I really didn't even consider it trauma around whether or not I'm supposed to be here, because it's one of those things that it's so ingrained. It's so part of who we are. And so to be able to kind of take myself out of that is like, you know what, this is really crappy. And the things that we are doing right now, hopefully, is going to have an impact on the next generation. So that's not a thought that they even have to consider, because people around them look like them. There are people around them that are all kinds of nationalities, and that they feel as if they belong and that they're making a contribution.
Well, I love this conversation, because for me, it always triggers memories and stories that give me an ability to put things in context, and this whole question of where you belong, right? So my wife, Bobby, and I used to walk all winter long, love Minneapolis because of the Skyway system. We'd drive down to Washington Avenue around 3rd Street or 4th Street at the end of the Skyway system at 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning. And then we walk 45 minutes. The Skyways are open even through the department stores and the other businesses. They had a cordoned off route. We could walk all the way down to the Hyatt Regency, touch the last door, then walk back. So it's a total of an hour and a half every day that we walked. I remember walking back one day, Danielle and Bobby and I saw this little white kid, maybe 3 years old or 4 years old, a little boy, walking by himself like he owned the Skyway. And this was back at a time, man, mind you, when there were people that were unhoused, sort of not camping, but spending time and resting for long periods of time in different places in the Skyway, despite their excellent camera surveillance system and a system for trying to keep, the residents and the visitors and walkers safe. So we were sitting there saying, as we walked, how's this kid here at 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, walking by himself? His parent, mom, and another child in a stroller almost a block away. So we said, what's that telling us, right? It's telling us that the mom is allowing the kid to grow up knowing that he owns the space. He's free at 5 in the morning, at 5 years old, to walk wherever he wants to with impunity. Now, neither of us will allow our child, sometimes even ourselves, to be somewhere where the potential risk might exist. But how is it that there's that kind of freedom? So what's the difference in the mindset and in the pressure, the trauma, and the lack of trauma that allows that confidence and that sense of equity and ownership versus what our experience is? Al McFarlane, a 22-year-old grown man, hitting the internal panic just because he turns the corner and sees a building that he associates with white power, white people. That's the story. That's the connection. Well, listen, Habitat is intentional in addressing the question of equitable land use. You've got a tab on your website. Tell us about the strategy, the philosophy, how the organization addresses discriminatory land and zoning policies to create more affordable homes and more equitable opportunities. Danielle.
And I would also kind of go back to that in partnership. Right. And so again, when we're looking at what's happening in municipalities and kind of, HOAs and things like that, we can't do that alone. And so we have to build those relationships with other organizations that are just as committed to racial equity and housing as we are. And so when you're looking at where we're building in communities where people want to live. I think that's also in response to when we look at gentrification. That's something that happened in Chicago, where I grew up, and that I used to love walking in a neighborhood. We live really close to Lake Michigan. You go 2 blocks, there's Mantis. You go another 2 blocks, there's kind of the affordable housing pieces. But it's also kind of a looking at people who are getting displaced by what we're kind of talking about progress. That's not real progress. And so we want to make sure that where people are living, when they're renting, that they stay. They have the opportunity to stay there. And so exploring those partnerships with organizations, municipalities, and honestly, again, listening to our home buyers, where do you want to live? I think there's also the element of let's make sure if people want to stay there, they stay there. But if they want to move out, they have that choice. And so that's something that we hadn't, I think, as a society has given people that choice before. And so that's definitely where Habitat is going, is giving people choice, because we don't, again, that shoe doesn't fit you, but we're going to force you into it. But we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to have home, to have that safety. Because again, it points to so many other success factors when we're talking about health outcomes, when we're talking about access to jobs, when we're talking about access to green spaces in a safe community. That's where we want to operate.
Let me shout out people who are liking the conversation. Brother Anura Asar, thank you for the thumbs up. Brown Zaire, Rhonda Brown Zaire, Rhonda, thank you for the thumbs up. And Marshall Holman, thank you so much for your work in community. Thank you for the thumbs up. And let me shout out Michelle Delicious Delights, our regular supporter, viewer, contributor from out east. She says, greetings, Brother Al McFarlane and distinguished guests. And she's sharing the program. That's what we want you to do. Wherever you are, share, like, subscribe, stay on top of this conversation, help us grow it. And I want to also shout out Bliss Alliance 54, who responded to the baseball offer and sent a couple of notes in, posts in, as I asked Bliss to do. Start with the word baseball, but then make your comment. And 2 great comments. One, the first one was that community enhanced programs like this help provide hope to pillar neighborhoods impacted by vested interests. Let's talk about that in a minute. And then the second comment from Bliss Alliance 54, great comment. The power of a safe character is valued by community partners, especially during our frigid and fun, I think that's what, if I'm reading that wrong, you can correct me, seasons, right? So housing, Jonathan, react if you will. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's very right. These are the kinds of things that can help provide hope within communities, that can help us address the systemic racism that exists and the disparity. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges we have, is getting people, one, connected into these programs, but getting programs like this started, because too often these are thought of as being, handouts or special ways of helping certain people. And you get people who get angry about that, and they don't realize this isn't a special handout or a special apportionment. This is actually redressing the things that were already done and were wrong that prevented people from having these communities. And a large part of that is because we teach the history of slavery and segregation as the history of Black people instead of as the history of white people.
Yeah.
When you see that in this country, it is always thought of as this is what happened to versus this is what this group did that created this disparity that now exists. And we as a country have to address it. And we have to go ahead and make right what was wrong with this country. And as you're seeing now, Kamala Harris coming out and moving so fast, it is beautiful. But already the misogyny, the racism, all of those pieces have already hit because people think that's okay. And just like you were talking about, Al, in terms of the freedom to walk, there are so many within white power structures that make it okay to just do anything instead of looking at the ways of citizenship and the 14th Amendment and making sure that everybody has the opportunity to take a full investment into the American dream and getting to a place that they can just feel like people. That's the hardest part, I think.
And like what I'll add is it's again kind of that generational trauma piece too. And so if you're hearing that, that's what you're learning in school, you begin to internalize that. And so when you internalize that, that's going to be expressed in how you talk to your children, how you talk to your neighbors, your view of the world. And the only way to actually defeat that, it's going to be a long journey. Let's be real. The only way to kind of defeat that is to understand that history and how it wasn't solved when we did when affirmative action was put forward. I mean, let's kind of see what happened to affirmative action in most recent years too, right? And so understanding where we started is that step one. Otherwise, we're, again, as you said, it's like we're creating special appropriations. It's like, no, this is how we do the right thing.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. My guest for this program, Wednesday, we talk about wealth creation and home ownership as one of the tools for that. My guest is Danielle Duncan with Habitat for Humanity, and Jonathan Palmer, one of my regular companions on the show, talking about anything and everything. You know, Danielle, I mentioned before we began that I love to be personal in this program to the degree that you're willing, and to ask you whose shoulders you stand on. You mentioned growing up in Chicago. You mentioned the fact that your family experienced getting evicted from properties, but yet you demonstrate, exemplify the power and resilience, the regenerative hope that keeps us coming forward and moving into the future with both gusto and with conviction and with success. Talk about, you know, your family, your story. I also said, you said Chicago. I said Chicago by way of. So tell me who you are. Tell me who you are, Danielle Duncan.
Yep. And so, like I said, it's originally born and raised in Chicago. And so when we talk about Chatham, South Shore Drive, graduated from there, from high school there. What I remember most impactful as I was growing up is family. And so we grew up in the Dearborn homes, the projects. And so we all were there. We all supported each other. And so when you even kind of look at what the view of the projects are right now, it's like, that wasn't my experience. There wasn't a lot of that violence. There was supporting each other. Now, there was always rift between the Dearborns and the Ickies, you know, kind of the other projects, but that's, you know, that's going to come. But what it was a sense of community, that no matter how bad it got, you had someone you can rely on. And whatever, if you were hungry, you always fed. So that's one thing I would say, I never went hungry. There was always food around. And so when we look at the community that I want to build, that I'm a part of, or even with my family, it's like you always have that safety, because the world is hard. Let's just be real. People are going to people are going to have their opinions no matter what. And some of those things you cannot change, but you can support each other in a way that's going to move us forward. forward. And so what I like to think is that some of the lessons that were taught to me, I've been able to kind of pass on to my family and to the next generation. Anyone who will listen, is that when you look at kind of where we are in society as a whole, the only way for us to combat some of that ill will is to work together. Let's build a coalition, because that is going to kind of go through all of that noise.
Jonathan, thoughts?
I so agree. My mom's actually from Chicago, so those are ringing some bells for me. I actually grew up in DC, so similar kind of story. It's a totally different place. Southeast DC is not anything that you recognize, nowadays. But also, my parents got married when it was illegal for them to do so in the country. So Dad was a white Southern Baptist from Columbus, Mississippi, who married a black Catholic from Chicago, Illinois. And when my grandfather showed up to stop the wedding, we joked that we don't know if it was the race or the religion that was the bigger deal. But we lived in both DC and then a community called Reston, Virginia, which was a planned integrated community. So the guy who started it built it to be a place in Northern Virginia for integrated families to come to, and black and white and other groups to be able to mix. And it is fascinating to see now how it's grown. It's much bigger and much more metropolitan now. But even when doing that, there was sections of the community that you would have labeled the projects or project adjacent at that point. And it just shows you how built into our system the low income and the marginalized housing is. But that sense of community that Danielle was talking about, in terms of the neighbors that you had, we had those neighbors that you could, one you could go to if there was any kind of a problem. You can go right across the street to Mrs. Johnson's house, or if you were doing something wrong, Mrs. Johnson might catch you, right? And she might take care of it right then, and then send you home and call your parents. And then when you got home, there was a whole
the rest of it.
Yeah, we won't go into that too deep, but that's the thing that I think, and especially African American communities have, is that connection that has helped us raise our kids, that has helped us build that network so that we looked out for each other and we're able to help each other, so that you get more of a chance of success.
Yeah, but what that also kind of reminds me of is when we look at displacement, right? And so look at 94, that just kind of plowed through the Rondo neighborhood, and even kind of some of the things that we're looking at right now, not Habitat, but kind of, Minnesota, it's breaking those community connections. And so if you're similar to how we were growing up and you had that community, that's not there anymore.
It's different. I ask you about shoulders you stand on. You mentioned your parents. What about your lineage? What about how much do you know about your grands and great grands, your Africanity, or your being a foundational Black American?
I don't know much outside of so I was, my great grandmother was alive. So I remember speaking to at her 95th birthday party. So I think she made it to 97. So of course knew my great grandmother. My grandmother is still alive. She lives over in North Minneapolis. She spends her time in Brooklyn Park. And then my mom, she actually moved from Chicago to be with us in Minnesota. And when I was pregnant with my second child, Herbie, there was really no point in me going back to school. Going back to work. I would make $20. And so again, when we talk about the community always being there, my grandmother actually retired from being a CNA from Chicago and moved up here in order to help us raise the children. And again, it was a godsend. I would not have been able to do that before. As far as kind of lineage back, I haven't necessarily gotten into that. I think I have some concerns about DNA being publicly available. Not necessarily for me, but for those who I might be tied to.
Interesting.
I've been tracing that. I've got a very interesting trek because I've got on my father's side, it is Scottish ancestry, and on my mother's side, the African American. And one, you get to see that juxtaposition of how easy it is to access records when you're not brown, right, and where you can trace pieces back. But we've been finding some very interesting aspects on the African American side. My mom just sent me this photo of my great grandfather's shoe shop. It was Naaman Tolbert Shoes in Chicago, and so he had like a shoe shop, and then it's him in the shoe shop. And we found back to the closest enslaved relative. And then going back, and right now we're peeling back a layer that looks to be a enslaved family that came through a white family, but then in the will setting that family free and insisting on them being able to stay together and things. So just at the point of unraveling a lot of those pieces. But it is truly fascinating because then you can see so much clearer the shoulders that you stand on and the journey that African American families have had to make, especially in juxtaposition to white families, and what that difference is and how much harder it is for us.
Yeah.
I talk about this all the time, Danielle. Jonathan, you may have been on when I talked about it before, but I actually knew someone who, when she was born, was the property of white people, and that is my grandma's mom. And I remember, meeting and being with her, being held by her, and punished by her, cracked on the back of my hand with a spoon for sticking my hand into a number 5 barrel of cotton, fluffy white cotton, attractive to a 5-year-old. Looking up at the rim of the barrel, stick my hand in. She said, "Crack, get your hand out of there. You don't know what's under that cotton. Could be a snake," right? Point is, I didn't realize that until I was an adult, a few years ago, that this picture of her sitting next to her daughter, my grandmother sitting next to her daughters, my mom and my mom's sisters, and then me and my cousins all sitting on the floor in our uncle's brownstone in Kansas City. But that multi-generational picture included the fact that the elder in that picture was born in the 1850s, 1850s, before the end of slavery, and born as the property of other human beings. And so to me, it just means it's close. It's not something that I can forget and think it's something in the distant past. It's real, it's close. And I'm thankful for the technology, Danielle, that allows me to try to do support my reaching and connecting with other elements of my family. Well, listen, this has been a wonderful conversation. I want to circle back to, the point of the conversation, and that is housing and the work that Habitat for Humanity does. One of the things I noticed was you launched a program called Special Purpose Credit to advance Black home ownership. Let me have you close explaining what that is and inviting people to connect with Habitat.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so our special purpose credit program is part of our Advancing Black Homeownership program. So if we again go back to the data where we recognize that, hey, we have a problem, there is a demographic that is we're being left behind. What we were able to do was again listen to community and create this this supplement kind of program that is going to give people who identify as U.S. born descendants of enslaved Africans that additional support. I go back to when you look at the demographics that have been marginalized, it's African Americans, those who identify as foundational Black Americans. And so what can we do as an organization to do our part in closing that gap? So as part of that special purpose credit program is financial coaching that's culturally relevant. There is cohort learning, and so you're in a room learning about financial trauma with people who look like you, being taught by people who look like you, and also that additional down payment assistance. And so when you look at kind of one of the barriers, of course, is being able to have that down payment assistance and not being able to kind of to get out a loan or have savings. And so we have access, people who go through the program have access to that. And so I believe we have our 4th cohort graduation that is happening on August 17th. So again, a group of individuals who have signed up to be part of Habitat's community to get that financial education, to get those financial supports, and get on the path to not home ownership, not just home ownership, but sustainable home ownership. We would do more harm if we're getting people into home ownership opportunities and they're not able to sustain it. What I love about the Habitat home ownership program is when we talk about payments, it's capped at 30% of your income. So when we talk about affordable, we really mean affordable.
Listen, thank you so very, very much, Danielle, Duncan. Thank you, Brother Jonathan Palmer. What a wonderful conversation. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.